wind howled through the frozen pines as the world around the small Alaskan town of Talkeetna lay covered in sheets of white. It was January 1981, and winter had wrapped the land in silence, the kind of silence that carried secrets. Beneath that quiet, something terrible was about to happen, something that would leave an icy scar on the hearts of everyone who lived there. 24-year-old Laura Jensen was known around town as the kind of person who could brighten a dark day. She worked at a tiny roadside cafe called Frostline Diner, the kind of place where truckers, hunters, and locals all came to warm up over black coffee and stories about the wild. Laura was studying wildlife biology through correspondence courses from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, dreaming of one day working in Denali National Park. She lived alone in a small cabin a few miles outside of town, close to the frozen Susitna River. People remembered how she always walked to work no matter how cold it got. She'd wear a thick green parka with a fur-trimmed hood and snow boots that squeaked in the frost. She'd hum old country songs as she trudged along the icy trail leading from her cabin to the highway. It was a lonely route, but she said she liked the peace of it, the stillness, the beauty, the way the cold air felt clean in her lungs. On January 17, 1981, Laura didn't show up for her shift. Her boss, Hank, thought maybe her car wouldn't start. But by noon, her co-workers began to worry. Laura never missed a shift. By dusk, the town marshal was out on the snowmobile trail looking for her. Her cabin door was closed but unlocked. Inside, the wood stove had burned out hours ago. Her parka was gone, her boots missing, but her wallet sat on the small kitchen counter. Outside, there were footprints leading toward the river. They stopped abruptly near a frozen patch where snow looked disturbed, as if someone had fallen or struggled. That night, search parties went out with flashlights and dogs. The temperature dropped below zero. For 2 days, men and women from town combed the woods, calling her name, their breath turning to mist. Then, on the third day, a searcher found something, a torn piece of green fabric half buried in snow. Another few yards ahead, near the E.T. river's edge, they saw the frozen outline of a boot heel pressed into the ice. When the ice thawed weeks later, the river gave up its secret. Laura's body was found downstream, trapped against a logjam. She was still wearing her coat. The coroner said she had blunt force trauma to the head, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Her time of death was estimated to be the same night she disappeared. The shock hit Talkeetna like a winter storm. Nobody could understand how something like that could happen there. The population was barely 400. Everyone knew everyone. People began locking their doors, something they never used to do. The Alaska State Troopers took over the investigation. They questioned everyone who might have seen Laura that day. Customers at the diner, loggers working along the river, snowmobilers, truckers who passed through on the Glen Highway. One name kept coming up. Eddie Larson, a 32-year-old handyman who lived on the outskirts of town. He'd been in the diner that morning, drinking coffee at the counter, watching Laura. Some said he'd asked her out a few times and she'd politely said no. Troopers visited Eddie's small shack near the woods. He denied seeing Laura that day. He said he spent the whole afternoon fixing a generator for a neighbor. The neighbor confirmed the story. The troopers checked his truck, his tools, his boots. Nothing matched the prints found near Laura's cabin. With no evidence tying him to the crime, they had to let him go. For weeks, the investigation froze, just like the ground. No weapon was ever found. No witnesses came forward. Laura's parents flew up from Anchorage for the funeral, their faces pale and hollow as they stood beside her small grave under the snow. In the months that followed, the town began to move on, but quietly. People avoided talking about it. The trail near Laura's cabin grew over with weeds by spring. Her cabin remained empty, its chimney dark. The case file was boxed up and stored away in a trooper's office in Wasilla. Years passed. Talkeetna changed. Tourists came in summer for fishing and flight-seeing tours. The Frostline Diner got a new owner, and Laura's name faded from local talk. But for those who had known her, especially her younger sister, Mara Jensen, who was 18 at the time, the wound never closed. Mara left Alaska for Seattle in the late 80s, but she never stopped asking questions. Every year on the anniversary of her sister's death, she'd call the state trooper's office. Most years she'd get the same answer. No new leads, ma'am. The case remains open. By the early 2000s, Alaska's Cold Case Division began re-examining unsolved murders using new forensic technology. Old evidence that had once seemed useless, fibers, hair, trace materials, could now be analyzed using DNA profiling. In 2003, Trooper Detective James Corbett, newly assigned to the division, stumbled on Laura's file. Something about it caught his attention. Maybe the photos, maybe the way her sister had kept calling after so many years. He decided to reopen the evidence box. Inside were a few sealed bags, Laura's coat, her gloves, a torn scrap of cloth, and several hair samples collected from her parka. The report from 1981 had listed them as inconclusive. But Corbett knew that back then, DNA testing didn't exist in Alaska labs. He sent the samples to a modern facility in Anchorage. Weeks later, the results came back. Most of the samples belonged to Laura, but one, a single strand of hair caught in her coat collar, was from an unknown male. Corbett ran the DNA through the National CODIS database. Nothing came back, no match, but he didn't give up. He began tracking old suspects, especially those who had left Alaska years earlier. When he found the old name Eddie Larson in the file, he ran his criminal record. Larson had moved to Oregon in 1989 after working several jobs in Anchorage. He'd never been convicted of a serious crime, though he'd been arrested twice for bar fights and once for trespassing. Nothing violent enough to get his DNA entered into CODIS. In 2004, Corbett tracked him down in Bend, Oregon. He requested a voluntary DNA sample, telling Larson it was part of a review for an old unsolved case. Larson agreed without hesitation, even joking that they'd never find anything on him. But weeks later, when the lab compared Larson's DNA to the unknown strand from Laura's coat, it wasn't a match. Corbett felt the sting of disappointment, but not defeat. He knew the DNA didn't necessarily belong to the killer. It could have come from anyone Laura brushed against. Still, it meant the trail had gone cold again. Then came a small break. A retired logger named Sam Wilkes reached out after reading an article about Alaska cold cases. He said he remembered seeing a man parked near the Susitna River Trail the day Laura vanished. He'd been driving a light blue pickup truck with rust around the wheel wells, not a common sight back then. Corbett went through the old vehicle, registration logs from 1981, and found only 3 trucks matching that description in the Talkeetna area. 2 belonged to locals who had been accounted for. The third belonged to Harold Hal Keating, a construction worker who had left Alaska in 1982. Keating's name had never appeared in the original investigation. There were no records of interviews, no statements. It was as if he'd never existed in their files. Corbett dug deeper. He discovered Keating had moved to Washington State, remarried, and worked in road maintenance for decades. He had no criminal history, no arrests. Still, Corbett requested his DNA. It took almost 6 months to get it processed through voluntary channels, but when the results came back, his heart stopped. The strand of hair from Laura's coat matched Keating's DNA with 99.98% certainty. The next step was confirming whether Keating had any reason to cross paths with Laura. That part would come soon, and when it did, the revelation would stun everyone who thought they knew the truth. Detective James Corbett sat in his Anchorage office on a grey November morning, the wind rattling the window panes as he stared at the lab report. The DNA match was conclusive. Harold Hal Keating had left his genetic trace on Laura Jensen's coat. It wasn't a coincidence, and Corbett knew it. Still, he needed more than a single strand of hair to build a case. He started digging into Keating's past, traveling through old employment logs and town records from the late 1970s and early 80s. Keating had worked in road construction along the Parks Highway, just 10 miles from Talkeetna, around the time Laura was killed. He would have driven that route daily, and as Corbett compared dates and maps, something clicked. The day before Laura's disappearance, Keating's crew had been working near the same trail she used to walk to the diner. Corbett traced Keating's timeline carefully. He discovered that in early 1982, just a few months after Laura's death, Keating abruptly quit his job and left Alaska. No notice, no explanation. He sold his truck to a local salvage yard, packed up, and drove south to Washington State. That blue pickup, the same color and description the logger had mentioned, was never seen again. Corbett took this information to the cold case unit and laid it out like puzzle pieces. The DNA, the truck, the timeline, the proximity to the trail. It wasn't just coincidence anymore, but what Corbett needed now was corroboration, something to show contact between Keating and Laura that went beyond speculation. He reached out again to Laura's younger sister, Mara, now living in Portland. When she picked up the phone, her voice was cautious but steady. After hearing the news that a new lead had been found, she grew quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "I always thought it was someone she knew, someone who smiled at her." Mara agreed to fly up to Anchorage to meet with Corbett. She brought with her a box of her sister's old belongings, letters, notes, and photographs. Inside, among the folded papers, was something Corbett hadn't seen in the old evidence list. A small envelope with a folded page torn from a road maintenance log. The handwriting read, "If you ever need help with your car again, just holler." Hal, from the highway crew, that was all Corbett needed. He verified that the handwriting matched Keating's work documents from 1981. The note was proof of contact, a direct link between Laura and Keating. Suddenly, the case that had been frozen for more than 2 decades began to thaw fast. In early 2005, Corbett coordinated with Washington State Police to quietly approach Keating at his home in Spokane. He was 71 by then, gray-haired with a stooped posture but still strong in the shoulders. He worked part-time at a local auto repair shop, known around his neighborhood as the friendly old man who always offered to fix your snowblower. When the 2 detectives knocked on his door, Keating seemed unbothered. "What's this about?" he asked with a faint smile. Corbett showed his badge and said, "Mr. Keating, I'm here about a young woman named Laura Jensen, Talkeetna, Alaska, 1981. For a moment, Keating's smile faded. His eyes shifted to the floor. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "We know," Corbett replied, "and we just want to hear what you remember." Keating invited them in, offering coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he poured it. They spoke for nearly an hour. Keating admitted to working near Talkeetna that winter, but denied ever knowing Laura. "I might have seen her in town once or twice," he said. "Pretty girl, yeah, but that's all. I never talked to her." When Corbett mentioned the note with his signature, Keating's jaw tightened. He said he didn't remember writing it. When asked about his old blue pickup, he said he'd sold it before leaving Alaska. Then Corbett leaned forward and said, "We found your DNA on her coat." The room went silent. Keating blinked slowly, then let out a breath that sounded like defeat. He didn't say a word for nearly a full minute. Then he whispered, "I didn't mean to hurt her." That was the beginning of the confession that would finally solve the case. Keating explained that he had stopped to offer Laura a ride that cold evening, just before dusk. Her car had been giving her trouble earlier in the week, and he'd offered help once before. She declined, as she always did, preferring to walk. But when she slipped on the icy trail, he got out to help her up. According to him, they argued, she told him to leave her alone, that she didn't want his help. He said something snapped in him. He struck her once with the flashlight he carried for work. She fell, hit her head on the ice, and stopped moving. Panic set in. He dragged her toward the river, thinking no one would find her until the thaw. He claimed he never intended to kill her. He was just scared. Corbett and the Washington officers listened quietly as he spoke, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. By the time Keating stopped talking, his eyes were wet. "I thought about turning myself in 100 times," he said, "but life just kept going." Keating was arrested on April 12, 2005, and extradited to Alaska to face charges of second-degree murder. The news hit Talkeetna like a shockwave. People who remembered Laura, even those who had only been children at the time, couldn't believe it. The man responsible for the town's longest mystery had been living an ordinary life hundreds of miles away for more than 2 decades. At the arraignment in Anchorage, Keating appeared frail, wearing a faded orange jumpsuit. When the judge asked for his plea, he said, "Guilty, Your Honor?" His attorney later explained that Keating didn't want a trial. He wanted to tell the truth before he died. In his sentencing hearing, Mara Jensen stood to address the court. Her voice trembled, but her words cut through the silence. For years, my family lived in the dark, wondering who could do this to her. We imagined monsters, but you weren't a monster. You were a man. And that's somehow worse, because you could have stopped. Keating wept openly as she spoke. The judge sentenced him to 35 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20. Given his age, it was effectively a life sentence. After the hearing, Mara walked outside the courthouse into the cold Anchorage air. Reporters asked how she felt. She paused, staring at the snow-covered ground, and said, "It doesn't bring her back, but it brings the truth home." Over the following months, the Alaska State Troopers reopened several other old homicide files using similar DNA techniques. Laura's case became a quiet example of how persistence, both from family and from investigators, could bring justice even decades later. Back in Talkeetna, people began to speak Laura's name again. Her grave, once snowed over and forgotten, became a small place of remembrance. Each winter, someone, likely Mara, would leave a single white rose and a candle by her stone. Locals said the flicker of that candle could sometimes be seen from the road, a small, glowing reminder against the dark. Detective Corbett eventually retired, but he kept a photograph of Laura Jensen in his office until his last day. He used to say that her case taught him something most police officers never want to admit, that time can bury truth, but not forever. In 2018, Keating died in prison. There was no family to claim his remains. The Department of Corrections had him buried quietly in a small plot near Juneau. Mara was notified but chose not to attend. Instead, she returned to Talkeetna that winter, standing once more near the river where her sister's story had ended. The water moved slowly beneath the ice, the air sharp and still. She placed her hand on the railing of the small wooden bridge and whispered, "It's over now." For the first time in nearly 40 years, the cold case that had haunted Alaska's wilderness had found its ending. The icy trail had finally led home,